Good morning, Tracy UMC, and a very happy Easter to you all. I hope you've all had a wonderful morning so far with your family, maybe doing some Easter egg hunting because the bunny left y'all some Easter eggs, maybe got some candy. Um, yeah, and now we are here to have a little sermon to celebrate Easter. So, let's get to it. So, as we celebrate Easter this morning, many of us might feel a bit anxious and or isolated due to the restrictions put in place to try and stop the spread of the coronavirus. Across the nation, non-essential businesses have been shut down, schools have been closed, and public gatherings are banned. It's kind of like living in a sci-fi novel. But there can be no doubt about it. Easter in the year of 2020 is not Easter as usual. So, how can we celebrate and rejoice together on this Easter morning? It is a little bit of a bummer. But in our gospel lesson for this morning, we are confronted with a roller coaster of emotions, perhaps kind of like what many of us are facing today. And our story begins in darkness. In a very real way, Mary herself was feeling socially isolated. After all, here she was, coming to a tomb by herself in the darkness. The pain she was experiencing was beyond description. And what she had experienced on Friday was blazing through her. She had watched as Jesus Christ, her Lord and Savior, her best friend, was beaten and nailed to a cross and left to bleed and suffocate alone and eventually die. His body had been taken down, and instead of leaving it for the birds to peck and the dogs to eat at, Joseph and Nicodemus had gone to Pilate and asked for the body. They wrapped it in spices with strips of linen and laid it in a tomb where it would stay all by itself. Then a large stone was rolled over the entrance, sealing it. Saturday was the Sabbath, the day that no one could work. And what an awful day that must have been for the followers of Jesus. What a feeling of loneliness and despair must have come upon them and then threatened to swallow them up. They must have felt so helpless, so confused, in shock. They had heard Jesus tell them that he would be arrested and killed, but they had never really believed that it would actually happen. But it seemed to be the awful truth. After all, they had dropped everything in order to follow Jesus. They left their jobs, their dreams, and all their plans. They had been with him for an amazing 3 years. They had heard him talk about God and watched him love in ways that no one had ever loved before. He had fed 5,000 people with a few fish and a couple loaves of bread. He had healed the sick. He raised the dead, and he made the insane sane again. He had become their hope in the midst of the despair of their life. But now, he was the missing piece of the puzzle. He was dead and gone forever. So how could they go on? Was life even worth living anymore? Could you imagine the darkness? Imagine the pain? Could you imagine the feelings of hopelessness and despair? Perhaps some of you can. And perhaps even some of you are feeling this way this morning. This past Wednesday, the Reverend Gress Haas of Red Bank Baptist Church shared a request. A former member of his church died Tuesday night from the coronavirus, and it was pretty close to home for him. See, all of us are now living in a whole new reality right now. It's like nothing we have ever seen nor experienced. TV anchors are broadcasting from their homes now. People are walking the streets with face masks on. We aren't supposed to have parties. Kids can't have their friends over. The entire world is in what I would call a sheltered place. And for those who live alone, the feelings are even more stark. Many of us experience most of our social interactions with family, coworkers, friends, and our church. But most of these things are not available right now to us, and we don't know when they will be able to return. So, how are we able to celebrate the resurrection while many of us are isolated and anxious? See, on that first Easter morning, Mary Magdalene stood outside Jesus' tomb crying. She had come to mourn and show her respects to the one who meant everything in the world to her. But when she got there, the stone had been rolled away and the tomb was empty. Now, not only was she empty and alone, but now Jesus' tomb was as well. How could this be happening? And just when she thought things couldn't get any worse, she thought someone or some group had stolen the body of Jesus. The unimaginable darkness that she was in. But then there's something else in there as well, is there not? As Mary wept, she bent down and looked inside the tomb one more time. And what she saw were two angels sitting where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and one at the feet. Then the angels asked Mary why she was crying. They had taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they had put him. And at this, we are told that she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. She wasn't looking for a living Jesus. She had come looking for an unrecognizable dead body, the way Jesus had looked when he hung on the cross. She just thought Jesus was the gardener, the ordinary, the only person that she would have expected to see around a tomb that early in the morning. But then Jesus called her name. And when he did, she allowed her eyes to refocus, and everything changed. Have you heard Jesus calling your name? If so, have you allowed your eyes to refocus and have the new discovery of change? Throughout his ministry, Jesus ministered to people who were isolated, often breaking the rules of social boundaries. In Mark chapter 5, Jesus cast demons out of a man who had been isolated from society. He had been living alone in the tombs. And when the townsfolk found him with Jesus, we are told that he was dressed and in his right mind, sitting at Jesus' feet. He was a brand new person and had been reintegrated into the community. In John chapter 4, Jesus is traveling through Samaria. While resting near a well, a woman comes along who had been isolated from her community. She is surprised when Jesus speaks to her, let alone asks her for a drink of water. Jesus and the woman become involved in a lengthy conversation, which eventually leads her into the integration back into her own community as she leads others to Christ. So, whenever you feel isolated and alone, I want you to remember that Jesus has a special place in his heart for the widows, the orphans, the lepers, the blind, the prisoners, and those living alone on the margins of society. And Jesus, well, he's experienced the ultimate isolation himself. When hanging on the cross, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He did that for you. He did that for me. He can relate to whatever we are going through. He has the compassion and empathy. So again, how are we able to celebrate Easter in these isolated and anxious times? Well, I read a little longer into the Easter story this morning than I usually do. For we moved all the way from Easter morning to Easter evening. And we find on Easter evening that the disciples gathered behind locked doors, afraid, anxious, and isolated. And they weren't sequestering themselves for health reasons, but because they were afraid that their own leaders would come after them the way they had come after Jesus. And so they were sheltering in place, feeling isolated and afraid. And then Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he showed them his hands and his side. And then the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Are you feeling isolated or anxious this Easter morning? It's true that we can't celebrate Easter in the way we usually do this year. But the Bible reminds us that the risen Christ doesn't need the traditional trappings of Easter in order to appear and be present in our lives. And neither do his disciples. Instead, like it always is, Jesus comes to us in our loneliness. Jesus comes to us in our tears. Jesus comes to us in our fears and anxieties. He stands among us. And he is doing right now. He's doing it right now. He's being loving. And with that love and with compassion, he whispers to us, "Peace be with you." And even though it may not seem like it, things are going to be all right. And that is because Jesus Christ has risen from the dead. And death has been swallowed up in victory. The tomb is empty. God is with us always and forever. And that is all that really matters when it comes down to it. Yes, we may not be together in one place this Easter morning, but that doesn't mean we're alone. Jesus triumphs over the darkness and the loneliness of death as our hope. It brings us new life if we will believe. It overcomes our isolations and our fears. And we are reminded that we are not alone. And we got to thank God for that. Like I've said before in my other sermons, crazy time out there. And, I'll be the first person to say that, you know, it's not like I'm not affected, like most of you are, trapped in the house, can't do much. Haven't seen you guys in weeks. Haven't seen my friends from my other job in months. It's rough. And it leaves you to sit there and think a lot. But then you got to remember that God God went through all that too. And in his suffering came a new life. Came happiness, it came peace. So we got to stick it out. We got to be tough. And knowing the promises of what's going to happen after all this blows over. So once again, I wish a very happy, almost said Christmas, Easter to you guys. I hope you at least talk to your loved ones, your family. Find some joy in today. Because even though we're not together, we're not alone. Have a great Sunday. Have a great rest of the week. And I'll see you guys next Sunday. Amen.